a native of Walterboro, is the director of the Lexington County Museum right now, and a self-proclaimed lifelong history nut. So we're going to turn it over to him and learn about the Yemessee War.
All right.
And thank you.
I put I was a native of Walterboro, but that's because nobody knows where Islandton is. They do now, yeah. For a while they didn't know. I never thought I'd see Islandton in the New York Times. Oh gosh. So anyway, I'm gonna talk to you today about the Yamasee War, I mean this is just one I think of the most interesting subjects around. It's one that is little known. When you study history in grade school and in high school. So if you go back and study American history, especially in elementary school and high school, you learn about the colonial period, and unfortunately most of what you learn about happened in the Northeast and Virginia. You don't really hear too much about the colonial period down here. And if you learn about colonial wars, Indian wars, what you learn about is King Philip's War. That's basically what you learn about. And of course, King Philip's War, very important. It was one of the costliest and bloodiest wars in colonial history. But there's another war that was almost just as bloody, almost just as costly, and that's the Yamasee War. And it's something that really affected the history of South Carolina, and I'll explain a little bit about how it affected kind of where I now work in Lexington as well. All right. So I talked too much about some of the kind of before, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of the set the stage for the war and about some of the conditions that led to the war as well. So the colonization, of course, happened in 1670, or permanent colonization, I should say, happened in 1670 with the establishment of Charlestown. And what you see during this time period is that, of course, this was a time of change. So disease had already kind of swept through because of the Spanish colonization. And so you had Indian tribes that had existed that were combining because they were such low numbers. You also had a lot of movement that was going on. And so you had, when the English colonized South Carolina, you had some tribes that were allied with the Spanish. That became enemies of the colonists in Charlestown. So they wanted to kind of get away from them. You had others that wanted to take advantage of trade, so you had some of them move closer. And basically, to make a long story short, you had everybody trying to use everybody else. So they all wanted to use everybody to get what they wanted. So some Native American tribes would move closer to get protection, get access to trade guns, that sort of stuff. You had the colonists who were using some of these Native American tribes to defeat their enemies, to raid the Spanish, and then you had these kind of alliances that were trying to be self-serving. But you had sometimes, occasionally, tribes that would change alliances. They would say, you know what, we're sick of dealing with the English, we're going to ally with the Spanish, see what we can get with them, and vice versa. Sometimes the colonists would say, you know what, this isn't working out, we're going to ally with your enemy now, and so you're now our enemy. So there's a lot of movement going on, there's a lot of change going on. And so anyway, one of the tribes that moved into the area and had somewhat been allied with the Spanish, but decided to take advantage of the English was the Yamasee. And so the Yamasee, they were not native to South Carolina. They were not originally from here. And they probably were one of these tribes that kind of was a mixture of two groups. So they probably were a conglomeration that included the Guale Indians, which came from kind of coastal Georgia, and the Hittichi, which came from kind of farther west in Georgia. So they kind of banded together. Probably originally lived either in central Georgia on the coast or maybe a little bit farther west. But either way, they had kind of been allied with the Spanish, and they decided to they got sick of dealing with the Spanish. The Spanish may have tried to sell them into slavery, so they decided to move closer, move into the boundaries of the colony of South Carolina. And of course, South Carolina, again, was a struggling colony at this point. It had not kind of developed too far away from the coast, away from Charlestown, and they still had a lot of enemies out there. So Spanish Florida, of course, was a huge threat to the existence of Carolina. And so the colony of South Carolina welcomed the Yamasee. Again, this was a border between, they kind of would absorb the blow if Spanish Florida attacked. So they saw it as another ally and something that would kind of, kind of create a border between the colony of Carolina and Spanish Florida. So the Yamasee themselves were divided into kind of two different groups. You had the lower Yamasee, which was kind of farther south, and they were consistently referred to as heathens and infidels. So we think that they probably were not Christianized. And then the upper Yamasee, they were probably Christianized. They were missionized. And so I think I've got, let's see here, don't have that. But again, so this is a map showing some of the war and some of the battles. But the Yamasee were located in what is now current day Jasper, Beaufort, and Hampton counties. That was kind of what they referred to as Yamasee land, the Indian reservation. And they had several towns that you'll probably recognize today, some of these rivers and towns that are still out there. Pocatalico was a main Yamasee town. You also had Tomatley, which is just west of modern-day Sheldon. Pocasobo on the Whale Branch, again, the Whale Branch Creek that's down there, and Altamaha on Yemessee Creek. And so again, that's kind of where some of these names come from today. But Indian land was everything from the Combahee to the Savannah to the head of the Salkatchie River. So basically, you're looking at all this over here, not including Colleton County. And so again, this is a map showing kind of the state of tribes in 1715 there. But just to kind of give some background about the numbers we're talking about, so in 1715, there were around over 1,200 Yamasee Indians in that kind of Indian land, compared to about 6,000 total whites in South Carolina at that point. So again, they were a pretty large tribe. There are many reasons for the start of this war. There was not kind of one thing, but a lot of straws that ended up breaking the camel's back. And so one of the basic reasons, and you see this again and again, especially with the English, is that there was kind of a lack of understanding between Native and European cultures. So if you read some histories of kind of the Great Lakes area, the Midwest, the French and the Indians there did a better job, and they created what they called a middle ground. And so they kind of understood each other a little bit better, but not so much here. And for example, one thing that really kind of confused the English was the fact that Native American names would change over time, especially for males. So at the beginning, you would have one name. When you got to be a teenager, you would get another one. And then if you accomplished something, like killing a bear or doing something in battle, you would get a different name. And so this would confuse the heck out of all the English colonists, as you can imagine. But anyway, a big kind of source for conflict and controversy between Native Americans and the colony of Carolina was about the place of women in society as well. So in Native society, women were more in charge, had more responsibility, and you can kind of see this with the fact that Native American women were expected to have control over the raising of their children, with fathers having little say. And in fact, because they were kind of a matrilineal society with the mother's line kind of ruling, you often had uncles that had more say in the raising of the children than fathers. And of course, this was a lot different than European society and English society. So this, of course, caused some controversy. You had these traders that would go in to these Native American villages, Native American reservations and land. And of course, they would sometimes take girlfriends, they would marry some of them, and these unions resulted in children. And of course, the male traders would want to have a say in how their child was raised. And a lot of times did not want them raised by the Indians. They wanted them raised in the European method or English method. So this would kind of sour relations, as you can imagine. Some traders would actually take their children and send them to Charleston so that they would be out of the reach of the Indian tribes. Again, this was something that caused a lot of controversy, especially if they were marrying daughters or sisters of the chiefs. Again, so you're kind of messing with the power structure at that point. And you also had a problem in some cases with domestic violence. So again, if you beat your wife, your girlfriend, and that's the daughter or the sister of the chief, it's really not going to cause good relations. I mean, that's not something you want to do. And of course, like everything in life, business often leads to conflict and confusion. So one simple kind of thing that caused a lot of controversy was the concept of credit. So Native Americans had a concept of credit, but it was different than the European concept. The Native American concept was not that you could, purchase something and then pay for it later, and that you would be owed. It was more about work. So basically, the only way you could kind of take something back from a Native American in their society was if they did not, kind of hold up their end of the bargain on working. So then you could take kind of things away. And of course, that's not the way it works in today's society or in English society at the time. And as a result of this, a lot of the Native American tribes, especially the Yamasee, were deeply, deeply in debt by the time of the war. For example, there are some sources that say by 1711, the Yemessee tribe owed 100,000 deerskins to the colonists for the goods and services they were receiving. And just to kind of give you some kind of a concept of how much that is twice the annual export total of South Carolina at that time. So basically, there was no way, the Yemessee were ever going to be able to pay off this debt. So they were deeply, deeply in debt. And so the traders would then, sometimes take items from Indians when the Indians owed, and of course, again, that caused conflict. So there's sources in the council journals where these Indians would go and complain to the colonial government about some of these traders, and sometimes this actually resulted in the council ruling in favor of the Indians. So in 1702, there was a trader named William Green who was ordered to return a canoe he took from a resident Altamaha town in the Yamasee area, and then there was a trader named Daniel Callahan who had to give back 2 guns he took from an Indian widow. So again, sometimes the council would try to keep the peace and try to mediate a little bit. And then on the flip side, occasionally you also had some traders that got in debt to the Indians and then refused to pay. And so some of the tribes would go to the council, South Carolina Legislative Council, and kind of plead their case about that as well. So one of the reasons that the Yamasee tribe and some of these other Native Americans got into debt was kind of changing fashion. So in the late 17th century, one of the big kind of fads in English society was wearing beaver skin hats. Everybody had to have a beaver skin hats. And then about 1702, fashions changed and nobody wanted to wear a beaver skin hat. You would be, that's passé. That's not something you want to do. So anyway, this confused the Indians. They're like, hey, last year when we owed this money, we were able to pay in beaver skins. Now you're saying you don't want it. Why not? They did not get that. So they kind of demanded some of these traders buy more skin. They're like, tell the people in London to buy more skins. So they didn't understand necessarily, kind of English fashion. There was also kind of an imbalance. So if you remember your American history, one of the things that the reason these European powers had colonies was because, what was it called? Navigation theory, I can't remember. But either way, the idea was that these colonies would make you money. Basically, you would get raw materials from the colonies, they would ship them to you, where you would process them, and then you would sell them back to the people in the colonies. So you were trying to make money for your country, for the people back at home. And so to do that, they sometimes limited what kind of manufacturing would take place in the colonies. So these Indians would provide skins, beaver skins, deer skins, different things like that. And then the traders would take it to Charleston. They would ship it to England, where they would tan it and then make leather goods, which would they then ship back to the colonies, where they would be sold at a much, much higher price. So basically, the Indians were sometimes on a losing deal, like a lot of people in South Carolina actually. And there also was, right around this time, I think it was the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession was later on. And again, these wars caused conflict, they caused ports to be closed, and so that raised prices as well, because it caused more, kind of shipping routes to be changed, and just raised prices overall. And so there is also, some people have looked at the deer population, and apparently right around kind of the 1705, 1710 into the 1712, 13, 14, 15 time period, the deer population apparently plummeted. And this may have been due to overhunting, just environmental changes. But either way, after the beaver skin trade ended, then Native Americans switched to deer skins to pay off their debts. And so now they were having trouble finding deer to actually kill to get the skins to pay off their debts. And this caused cultural changes as hunts became longer, and many tribes just kind of abandoned hunting for deer and basically started wars with other tribes so they could capture slaves, which they could then sell to the traders to sell their debts. And so this caused men to be killed. This caused men to do less hunting for the tribe in general. Women had to take on more of a burden. So it really kind of upset Native American society. And so it's kind of, I think, notable that the Yemessee War, when it did start, which I'll talk about soon, that it began at the time of the year when many traders went back into the villages of the Yemessee and these other tribes and demanded payment. So basically, I don't think that's a coincidence. All right. So I mentioned that, again, they started going to war to collect slaves. Well, slavery itself was an issue. So Indians had a concept of slavery. They did have slavery in their communities, but it's a little different than that practiced by Europeans. Oftentimes, this is not universal, but oftentimes tribes would take slaves. They would basically go to war. They would capture some people. They would make them slaves, but it was for a defined period of time, and it was kind of a way to initiate them into the tribe in some ways. So this is, of course, is different than the English and European definition of a slave, which, for Africans was permanent, and for Native Americans was permanent. And so, again, this kind of demand for Indian slaves led tribes to make war on other tribes, and this caused some conflict because sometimes they would pass off people who were not captured. Some of these Indians would try to, take advantage of the situation. So traders were supposed to wait 3 days after captives had been taken before buying them as slaves to make sure, number one, that they were actually captured in war, that they were not related to the chief of a tribe that the colony of Carolina was allied to. So you didn't want to upset them because this tribe, captured the sister of the chief and then was trying to sell them to you. That would cause conflict. And so they were also supposed to consult to see if they're actually slaves or not. So again, some of these tribes are trying to, kind of pass things off and pay off their debts that way. And so, again, going back to kind of gender roles, Indian slaves were almost always women, whereas African slaves were mostly men. And so by 1710, Indian slaves made up an estimated 20% of the total slave population in South Carolina. So it was starting to increase around this time period. You also had a situation, too, where Indian slaves, of course, a lot of times knew the geography where they were at, and they had, either cousins or allied tribes nearby where they could escape into the woods, go and escape to family members or, again, an allied tribe. Then that tribe or the family members would hide that person, and when the owner of the slave would go looking for them, so they're not here, we don't know what you're talking about. And so, you can see how that caused some friction. And you also had the problem with Indian slaves not being used to the type of agriculture the Europeans practiced. So a lot of times they died very soon after being enslaved and captured. All right. And so there was also, again, going back to this kind of debt scenario, there was also a glut of slaves starting in 1714. And so this caused imbalances, again, where these Native American tribes are going deeper and deeper into debt. So this was something that really scared the Yamasee. Another kind of constant complaint that you see in the sources is the fact that at that time there were no fence laws, and so animals such as cattle and pigs were expected to forage and kind of feed themselves. And one thing that they found out the hard way is that these animals don't respect human borders. So maybe this river, the Combee signifies, hey, this is Indian land over here. This is the colony of South Carolina here. Pigs don't know that. Cows don't know that. So they would cross, they would go over, they would eat Indian crops, sometimes destroy, sometimes damage structures they had. And this is something that comes up over and over again. Really, you had kind of three different things that occurred near the start of the Yamasee War that really kind of, again, started putting a lot of weight on that camel's back. So number one was a war in North Carolina called the Tuscarora War. And so the Tuscarora were a tribe in North Carolina that rose up, fought the colonists. So the colony of South Carolina sent troops, and they part of these troops were from tribes such as the Yamasee. So these Indian tribes went up, fought alongside the colonists of South Carolina. They defeated the Tuscarora, and what they saw is the Tuscarora were then enslaved. And so this was something that kind of was put in the back of the mind of the Yamasee, where they're like, we see what happens. We see what happens. So that kind of scared the Yamasee. Then you actually had a census that was taken in 1714 where the colony counted the Yamasee. And again, so you just had a war where you saw an Indian tribe was defeated in battle and enslaved, and now they're counting us. Where they're counting us to see how many slaves they're going to get. And so really the kind of final straw was that the colony of South Carolina did not communicate well with the tribes. They never knew really who was speaking for the colony of Carolina, and sometimes they didn't communicate at all. And so one thing that happened is they started to build a fort in Port Royal without telling the Yamasee. So that's basically right in Yamasee territory. And so the Yamasee kind of said, listen, they're counting us, they're building a fort, we think they're going to attack us. So the colony kind of caught wind of this, and they decided to try to, kind of cool things down a little bit. So they actually sent a guy named Thomas Nairn. He was appointed the diplomat to kind of go to the Yamasee and kind of calm things down. So he met with the Yamasee and basically said, listen, the colony wants peace. The census, the fort, this is just defensive measures. That's nothing to do with you. We don't want war. And so they listened to him. He went to bed. Unbeknownst to him, another guy from the colony, a trader, he did not speak for the colonial government, but he had in the past, came right after Thomas Nairn. His name is John Wright. And basically he said, listen, the Yamasee need to fall in line. Y'all need to be subservient to the colony. And if you don't do what we say, we are going to make war on you, and we're going to defeat you. In fact, there is a letter that was written by one of the chiefs of one of the towns of the Yamasee, and I forgot to bring my book that has the letter in it, but basically it's a kind of a letter describing why the Yamasee went to war. And in this letter, he says that John Wright told the Yamasee that if the Yamasee didn't fall in line, they were going to be treated like women. So basically he tried to put the fear of God in them. So the Yamasee didn't know who to believe. They had these two different people trying to speak for the colony. So John Wright went to bed. So the chiefs of the Yamasee met together and tried to figure out what to do, who to believe, all that kind of stuff. And they decided that that they couldn't believe the colony of South Carolina, that these things were too much and they needed to attack. And so they decided that very night, that they actually were going to go to war on the colony of South Carolina to protect themselves. So that was actually, the war started on Good Friday, April 15th, 1715 is when the war began. All right, and so this is a map showing, kind of the tribes at the time of the 1715 war. So one of the things, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is these other tribes basically had to make a decision when war broke out. They heard about it. There was no grand conspiracy, but they heard about it, and they had to decide whether they were going to fight on the side of the colony or whether they were going to fight on the side of the Yamasee. And so that's something we'll talk about here in a little bit later. All right, and so these are some of the kind of battles there. All right. So when the Yamasee decided to attack, they actually massacred all of the traders in their midst, almost all the traders. So Thomas Nairn, he was the first guy that tried to, let the Yamasee know that the colony wanted peace. He was actually roasted alive for several days before he was killed. And then Thomas Wright, who was the guy who said, we're going to defeat you if you don't fall in line, he was actually tortured and killed as well. So basically, as word spread among some of these other tribes, the traders in their midst were killed and sometimes tortured as well. So natives, they began to raid and kill settlers from Port Royal to the Edisto River, and a lot of the creeks over here in Georgia decided to do the same as well. So they actually attacked Pocatalico, after they attacked the colony, 2 men escaped Pocatalico, the 2 of the traders. They went to Port Royal and actually warned the people in Beaufort, which Beaufort had just been established in 1711. And so all of the settlers in Beaufort actually went out and got on a ship that was off the coast. So they were able to survive because they actually went down and basically set fire to the town of Beaufort, the newly formed town of Beaufort, and then returned to Pocatalico. So while one party attacked Beaufort and Port Royal, another one attacked across the Combahee River, and so that's this road. Yeah, there we go. All right. Yeah. So they crossed the Combahee, went into Colleton County here, and they raided plantations, they killed cattle, they killed settlers, and burned plantations. So this was kind of the first attempt. And one of the major things, again, is the fact that they're killing cattle, because, again, that was always seen as a major problem. That was very symbolic, cattle and pigs. And so the people that did survive actually fled from Colleton County, went to Charleston. Charleston was a walled city at that point, and there are still parts of the wall that survive today, but it was a walled city, so they felt protected there. So basically, by May 1715, so within 15 days, the southern parts of the county, of the state, which included a fifth of the province, were abandoned in panic, and people retreated to the walls of Charleston. So this, really, the ones that survived just managed to escape and go to Charleston. So that is kind of a drawing showing the walls of Charleston there. All right. So the colony, once it kind of got the people of Colleton County out, decided that they needed to respond. They needed to attack the Yamasee to protect property, to protect lives, and to stop the Yamasee from making it to Charleston. This major battle happened at Pocatalico, the Yamasee village. So Governor Charles Craven responded. He called out the Colleton Militia, who then went out. They stopped some of the attacks on the plantations and the people, and then were ordered to counterattack. So under his command, the militia marched to the head of the Combahee River near present-day Yemessee, where it met up with additional troops and boats. Then the main body was split into 2, and one, under the command of Governor Craven, proceeded to attack the village of Pocatalico. And in doing so, they met the Yemessee warriors who were coming from the Salkatchie Swamp. They surrounded them and routed them. So basically, when they responded, they actually kind of surprised the Yemessee and ended up destroying their main body. All right. So meanwhile, you had the other command, which was under a guy named John Barnwell, and his nickname was Tuscarora Jack. Tuscarora Jack, he had achieved fame in the Tuscarora War, so he decided to attack a fortified palisade about 4 miles from Pocatalico. So the Yamasee had kind of learned from the English colonists. They had seen their forts and decided that they would copy those. So a lot of times they would just put a bunch of logs either in a wall, a palisade, and then sometimes put pointed logs out to try to stop people from attacking. They attacked that, and there was a man named John Palmer, and John Palmer was quite the hero. He was a resident plantation owner in Port Royal. He distinguished himself for heroism by scaling the walls of the palisade twice, and in hand-to-hand fighting, he forced the Yamasee out of their fort and towards the troops that were waiting, where they were basically massacred. Really his heroics are the one thing that's kind of stopped the attacks there. All right. So the Yamasee, again, they were defeated at Pocatalico. They were defeated in their kind of fortified palisade wall. And so they decided to actually kind of retreat from the colony of South Carolina, and they decided to go down to Spanish Florida. And so again, they had been allied with the Spanish before, and they knew that basically if they had attacked the English colony of South Carolina, they would probably be welcomed with open arms in Spanish Florida. So they decided to retreat, leave the area, and go down there. But however, you still had, again, I'll show this map, like I said, you had these other Native Americans that are up here, and they had to make a decision. They had to decide what they were going to do. You had the Wateree, the Congaree, the Petee, some of these tribes that are still out there today. And basically, they decided that they were going to fight on the side of the Yamasee. So they kind of joined together. They formed an army, went down, and the colony's militia met them at the Battle of the Pond, so near modern-day Summerville, where they were defeated. So it was a guy named George Chicken, which is a heck of a name there. George Chicken and the Goose Creek Militia, they ambushed a scouting party and then engaged the main body of the Native Army, killing about 40 to 60 warriors. And so basically this kind of broke the alliance, and the backcountry Native Americans, as they were called, decided to retreat. So that's kind of a drawing there. So again, you had these battles on land, but that was not the only place you had them. You also had the battles in the waterways. And so this is a modern day reenactment. This is a scout boat. And these are some reenactors there. That's probably what a scout boat would have looked like. But basically, the colony of South Carolina had been trying to protect its borders, its kind of outlying areas because of the Spanish. So during Queen Anne's War, the Spanish would attack, would sometimes come up and try to burn and pillage. And so they had already engaged some of these scout boats before. And so basically they sent them back out, tried to patrol the rivers and creeks down in Beaufort and Colleton, trying to make sure that no Native Americans were trying to sneak up and burn or kill some of the settlers there. They were kind of like Marines, basically. So they would be on ships, they could fight on the ship. They would sometimes have a swivel gun on this boat, or they could land and then attack via land as well. And so John Palmer, who was the guy who scaled the walls of Pocatalico, was also a scout boat captain by this point, and he led a successful assault with 16 other scouts on a well-fortified Yemessee town north of Beaufort that had been reoccupied by Yemessee warriors. So they had left but then come back, and so he also participated in 2 well-planned ambushes of the Yemessee on barrier islands in the months that followed. So basically, kind of hit-and-run tactics. And so in the winter of 1715, this is right around the time when the colony of North Carolina and some people from Virginia came down as well to try to help out. So the main kind of thing that happened at this point, though, and really something that saved the colony of South Carolina, was the mission to the Cherokee. So the Cherokee were a major tribe, of course, very powerful. And to be honest, if they had joined in on the side of the Yamasee, history might be quite different. We might not have a colony of South Carolina right now, or a state of South Carolina, I should say. And so the Cherokee is kind of interesting. They were divided in some ways. So the Cherokee, if you studied any kind of history about them, you had 3 different sections of Cherokee. You had the lower towns, you had the middle towns, and then you had the over hills. So basically, the lower towns were in kind of South Carolina, Georgia, around Keowee, Clemson, Oconee County, that area. Then the middle towns were basically in the mountains, and then the over hills were the ones on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. And they all kind of, they were one tribe, but they also had kind of no real centralized government, and they also had different experiences with some of the English as well. So they all had different ideas. But basically, the English, the colony of South Carolina, did not want the Cherokee to get involved in the war, and so you had basically a mission up there to make sure that the Cherokee remained neutral or on the side of the English. And so in fact, an Anglican missionary named Francis Lejeune reflected, "Our hopes are increased by the expectation of the Cherokees, a very populous and warlike nation, entering into an alliance with us." So they thought, again, that the Cherokee maybe would join on their side. So in October, a delegation from the western towns of the Cherokee led by a pro-English leader, arrived in Charlestown and appeared to agree to an alliance with the English against the Creeks. But the Cherokees did not follow through and joining the British in a joint attack on the Creeks. So again, they said, yeah, we'll join, but but to ensure their alliance, Maurice Moore, who set out to the Cherokee towns with a force of, quote, 100 Negroes and Indians, and with perhaps 200 white men, including South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia troops. So the lower towns were visited at first because they were less inclined to get involved in a war on their Creek neighbors than the Overhill Cherokees. And so actually it's kind of interesting because the English delegation arrived at the same time that a Creek delegation arrived. So the Creek, they were allied with the Yamasee, and they actually wanted the Cherokee to join in on their side. So they kind of arrived at the same time. They both made their case, and it's very interesting because this is kind of what the history of the colony hinges on here. But the Creek delegation was killed by a pro-British Cherokee group, and the war broke out amongst the Cherokee and Creek, which took the pressure off of the colony of Carolina and allowed it its time to secure its borders and to attack and destroy the Yemessee and their allies. So really, this is kind of what the war almost hinged on right here, was the Cherokee not joining in on the side of the Yemessee. Part of it had to do with this kind of long-standing hatred they had of the Creeks. And again, the Cherokee and Creek kind of animosity would last for many, many, many years. All right. So this also would lead to the Lower Creek tribes who were suffering because of the war to waver as kind of allies of the Yamasee, and basically they sued for peace at this point. So this also helped the war effort. The Yamasee really were kind of on their own at this point. So a peace treaty was signed in June 1718 with the Creek Nation that basically ended hostility in the backcountry. So this did not really end the war, though. So if you read a lot of kind of articles on the Yamasee, what you'll see is the war supposedly lasted from 1715 to 1718. Again, that kind of ended the war in the backcountry, but the Yamasee were still there. They were still attacking settlements, so the war was still going on for for all intents and purposes. So they would basically leave Spanish Florida, the protection of Spanish Florida, come up the intracoastal waterway and attack plantations. They would burn, they would kill cattle, and do these kind of quick hit and run tactics on some of the areas there. And so basically what South Carolina did to try to stop this was to actually create forts in the backcountry to try to protect their borders and also control the trade networks. So there was actually a fort established at Pocatalico. So that was on the Savannah River in Hampton County, and it's at oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name of it. There's a boat ramp there today. But anyway, so it was named for a tribe that had lived there at one point, but they established a fort there. There was one up in what's now Beach Island in that area. And there was one in Lexington County where Congaree Creek flows into the Congaree River it was called Fort Congaree. They're not very, very creative when it comes to naming things. So they just called it that. But they also, besides creating these forts, they also decided to protect the settlements with 3 companies of rangers. And so basically these rangers, they were made up, or they were like a militia. If you're a member of the militia, the rangers, you're supposed to be able to provide your own horse, your own gun, and you're supposed to have a dog as well that you could kind of use to kind of hunt down some of these Native Americans. But basically, you had 3 companies of rangers: the Northern Rangers, which patrolled kind of near the Santee River, the Western Rangers on the Edisto, and the Southern Rangers on the Ashepoo and the Combee, and then they would kind of range down to the Savannah River. So basically, they would just kind of roam around looking for some of these Yamasee that managed to kind of come up and attack. So these rangers, they were oftentimes housed in some of these fortified locations like Pocatalico, and it was about 100 men that were members of the rangers. So each ranger scout, like I said, was to, quote, provide his own horse, his accoutrements, and provisions, and be armed with a gun, a pistol, and a cutlass, a hatchet, a powder horn with at least a quarter pound of powder, a cartouche box with 12 charges, and a large mastiff or mongrel bred dog to go constantly on them with scouting. So, so anyway, all right. So then you did have an attempt by John Barnwell, the Tuscarora Jack, to try to end the war in 1719. So he led a raid on Spanish Florida, where they ransacked and destroyed Yamasee towns, but they were not able to fully kind of extinguish the Yamasee threat. But one thing that you did have is in 1722, you had the creation of Fort King George. So this is down near Darien, Georgia. This is a reconstruction. It's a very cool site. I went last last summer, and the only thing that I didn't like, those mosquitoes were terrible. I used bug spray, and still, like, they were about to carry me off. But anyway, so this is down there, and this is actually a South Carolina manned fort. And again, this was trying to stop these Yemessee raids. All right. And so really, the final end of the war happened in 1728. And then this is when that John Palmer, again, he kind of comes up. You see some of these names over and over again, where he decided that he'd had enough. So he actually organized and led a large waterborne force of over 100 men. And on the night of March 9, 1928, they destroyed 3 Yemessee towns located near Saint Augustine, killing about 30 warriors. They then waited outside the fort at Saint Augustine for several days for the Yamasee to come out and left because they did not have the authority to engage with the Spanish. So again, they didn't want to start a whole war over this with the Spanish. But after this, basically the Spanish, the Yamasee felt that the Spanish did not do an adequate job of protecting them. So they were not too happy with the Spanish, and the Spanish, I think, decided at that point that the Yamasee were worth more than they gained. Again, they were not doing too much damage to the colony in South Carolina. They had other things to worry about. So basically, the Yamasee decided to leave, and the Spanish were not too sad to see them go. So the Yamasee decided to kind of retreat deeper into Florida to the swamps there, and the Spanish, kind of gave up on trying to protect them. So this was basically the end of the war after that. There were no more raids. And really led to the kind of end of the conflict. The Yamasee, when they retreated to the swamps of Florida, they were joined by some other tribes. They were also joined by escaped slaves. And after a while, that kind of conglomeration became known as the Seminole. And so Seminole, I think, means runaway, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's how we get the Seminole tribe today. It's kind of the remnants of the Yamasee, some other tribes, and runaway slaves. But as you can see, the impact on the colony of South Carolina, I mean, you had about 6% of the population killed, basically $22 million of property losses. You had all this money spent on defense, which was so much more than they gained through imports and exports. And one thing that occurred is you had a harshening of race relations after this. So before the war, you had all these kind of different categories. You had mestizo, you had mulatto, you had all these kind of different categories. After the Yamasee War, basically you were Indian, you were black, or you were white. That was it. There was only 3 categories. They also began to see the backcountry, they called them settlement Indians. So these were some of the Indians living within the borders of the colony of South Carolina, not in the backcountry. They began to see them as enemies. They started to wonder, hey, are they going to attack us next? Can we trust them? And they also began to worry, even though they had just kind of made an alliance with the Cherokee, they worried that could the Cherokee rise up on us? And so one of the things they decided to do is later on in the 1730s, so after the end of the Yamasee War, was basically they had this vacant land here. This is land that Native Americans had abandoned, and they decided that what they were going to do is they were going to open it up to settlement, and they were going to open it up to basically provide a buffer between the Cherokee and the Creek and the Low Country, where the government was, where the money was, and this would also allow them to get more white Protestants in. So this is right around the time too when their rice plantations that were taking off. They were importing huge numbers of enslaved Africans. So again, this would bring in more white Protestants, help bring the population to more equal terms. And so a lot of the communities that we have in South Carolina in the backcountry kind of owe their existence to this kind of township scheme, as it was called. And so, of course, Saxagatha right here, this is the county that I'm the museum director of, Lexington County, and that's kind of how Lexington County came about, was through that. There they started to attract Germans and Swiss Germans, and some of those Germans and Swiss Germans that settled in Lexington at first came down here to Colleton County as well. So my mom's side of the family, the Grubers, they came over to Saxagatha and then came down to the Edisto for some reason or another. The Smoke family, their name was originally Rauch, which is the German word for smoke, and a lot of them settled in Saxagatha. But again, it kind of changed, the outlook of South Carolina. And you also, again, had the creation of Georgia because of the Yamasee War. So South Carolina was very much in favor of the creation of Georgia because this meant that Georgia would be attacked by the Spanish, would be attacked by their Native American allies if they attacked. So basically, South Carolina was like, sure, give that land to Georgia. We don't want it. It's their problem now. All right. You also had the kind of emergence of the Cherokee. So the Cherokee became one of the main trading partners of the colony of South Carolina, and they became allies and protectors to the English. And it's very interesting that later on in the around 1760, you saw some of the same things that happened in the Yamasee War happen to the Cherokee, and that's what kind of led to the Cherokee War as well. All right. And so again, you had this kind of fear that grew out of this, and the Yemessee kind of became known as the Seminole. All right. Cool. I know it was a lot to take in. I just threw a lot at you there. But any questions about the Yamasee War and kind of how it shaped South Carolina's history?